two, one.
All right, welcome everybody to Artful Tuesdays. And today we're going to be talking about Vesta Dunning. And I asked this on social media. It seemed like a lot of people really were not familiar with this name, with who is
All right,
Vesta
welcome
Dunning.
everybody to Artful Tuesdays.
And I'm hearing my name, myself
Today we're going to be
echo.
talking about Vesta.
Is someone playing it in the background on accident?
Yes.
Oh, okay, there we go.
Of
Okay.
course.
I was hearing myself and I was getting tripped up. So we're going to talk about Vesta Dunning, why she's important, why she's critical to read, why it's interesting to read her, and who she is. I'm going to read a quote from her, and I'll be curious, like what people think her relationship and what she is in the novel. And this is or in this context. She says, "You're abnormal. You're a perverted egotist. You're a monster of egotism. You shouldn't exist." And I'll just say that is kind of leading up to a love scene. And, if you know Ayn Rand and if you know what's going on, there's, really interesting conflict happening with Vesta Dunning. And who she is, before I introduce these two people here, I'll tell you guys who Vesta Dunning is. And then I'm going to tell you who my two guests are today. Vesta Dunning was originally, in 1938, the girlfriend of Howard Roark. So she was the first girlfriend, at least in the context of the novel that Ayn Rand had written, which was called Secondhand Lives, in this draft. And she wrote this character, which has a long, before Howard meets Dominique, there's many series of their interactions throughout the beginning part of, I guess, part one of the novel, right? Is it part one? Because he meets her and then it goes into part two at that point, I believe, if I remember correctly. And Vesta Dunning played a very important part. And today I want to discuss who she is, why she's important, and ultimately why Ayn Rand cut her and what that might mean for, art and Ayn Rand's views on art and what she was trying to accomplish. So before we get into that today, I just wanted to mention we have Jeff Britting as a guest for us, and he is the archivist at the Ayn Rand Institute. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Kirk.
And of course, we have Ciccolella of Austin Shakespeare, who is now, I think, just a co-host. We're just going to say, not even a guest, co-host, not a regular guest that just kind of became a co-host, and I'm very happy to have that happen. So we're going to be talking about Vesta Dunning, and I'm just going to ask you two. I've given you my very brief description of who I think Vesta Dunning is. Who is Vesta Dunning?
Well, I mean, for me, Kirk, she's an actor, right? Well, we in the old days, you say actress, and now we've kind of called everybody actor. But that intrigues me. She's also very young. I think she's 18. Now, mind you, she is a fictional character. She's a fictional character. She was cut from the novel. So when you're talking about 1938, Rand is writing the novel, right? So she was never in the novel as it was published, but I think she's a really interesting character. And in the Early Ayn Rand, which is the book we're talking about, we have excerpts that make sort of, as Kirk said to us, a little short story of Vesta Dunning. So we'll learn more about her, but how would you answer that, Jeff?
Well, I would answer as an archivist, as someone who has focused not only on the printed word, but on the works leading up to the printed word, all the work product. So she is, Vesta Dunning is a character that has life as a part of the development of the novel and is laden with connections to not just the novel in progress, but to other characters that Ayn Rand was thinking about at the time. So I think of Vesta Dunning as Kay Gonda's little sister.
Well, tell
who's Kay Gonda? Yeah,
Kay Gonda. Since we're focusing on the Early Ayn Rand, or featuring something from the Early Ayn Rand in this program today, Kay Gonda is the actress, main character in the play Ideal. Which is a early play of Ayn Rand's that was included in the early Ayn Rand, and features another examination of the life of an actress, and in particular life of a Hollywood actress, but in using that background creates a really significant work around a person who is a passionate idealist. And in some respects, there's a crossover between the mature character of Kay Gonda and this young, passionate idealist, Vesta Dunning.
Yeah, and it's, so one of the things I think we need to say at the outset is this, this all comes in the early Ayn Rand, like Anne was telling, and there's a very interesting introduction to Vesta Dunning and other cut passages by Dr. Leonard Peikoff, who put together, this early Ayn Rand. And really I did want to quote one little thing before we talk any more about Vesta Dunning. And he says, quote, "If I may state the point paradoxically for emphasis, these events did not happen to Roark. They are pure fiction." So, and I love that line. Like the relationship with Vesta Dunning is pure fiction. It did not happen. In your evaluation and understanding of Roark, of the Fountainhead, of its artistic value, don't even think about it. The only value, but I do want to think about, I do think there's a value in reading this. I hope all of you will go read the early Ayn Rand. And by the way, just as a plug, we're going to be doing Red Pawn next. So start reading Red Pawn, the first thing Ayn Rand ever sold. Okay. But Vesta Dunning is, very interesting character, like Anne and Jeff are saying, in terms of Ayn Rand has had an interest in actors and writing for the stage and writing for the screen. And she has a passion for drama. And she's been, in her early days, Jeff, right, she tried to be a little bit of a silent screen actor, right? And I've seen some of the pictures of her, like, kind of practicing her silent screen faces and such. And, so she had
in college, she studied film, right? So when she was in Russia, Rand herself studied film. But, for me, Kirk, I have to say, part of the attraction is, if you've read The Fountainhead and read Atlas Shrugged, and you think you've read all of Ayn Rand, this is like reading new Ayn Rand.
Yes.
So that's how a lot of people who are interested get interested in the early Ayn Rand, because it's fresh. It's not what you've read and so on.
Yeah, if you truly love Ayn Rand for Ayn Rand and her literary achievements, I think you have to read these types of things. It's like, I love Wordsworth, and if someone showed me some hidden poem that no one had ever read before, or that was not published, it's like, oh my God, I need to read this, because I really love this person. And in the context that she cut it for certain reasons, which we could talk about at the end of the show, it's amazing writing. And that's something that's, Peikoff is talking in the introduction. Should he include this, or is it going to be confusing to people? And he lands in, he should publish this because it is Ayn Rand's best writing. And she said that herself. It includes some of her best writing up to the point of The Fountainhead, I think. And I think Atlas Shrugged might be its own special categories of amazingness. But that, I think, this is our pitch for reading this character of Vesta Dunning.
Jeff, did you want to add something?
Oh,
well, it's also a pitch for any kind of examination of process. When you take a really significant literary figure who had things to say in nonfiction and things to express in fiction, and you see this is all coming from the same brain, different ways of process of dealing with reality as an artist or as a nonfiction thinker and writer. It's really insightful to see what steps any such figure took in creating the work that resounds so vividly on the page as finished work. You ask questions. How did that get there? What was the genesis of it? Where did it start? How long did it take? What was the writing like? Did it all come out in one gulp, or did it come out in stages? Was it an effortless journey, or was there a lot of struggle? And some of the answers to those questions can be answered by simply looking at the discards, the cuts, the things that didn't get incorporated or that might get reincorporated elsewhere in another work at a later time. But there's also telling details that are embedded in the character that gets cut, things that are insightful, things that are relevant to what the writer's thinking at the time and the writer's life is like. That's why I think it's so rich and worth looking at.
Well, Vesta Dunning as a character is a very lively 18-year-old, right? She has a lot of ambition. The first time he meets her, she is rehearsing in his room because her room had a roommate. So she creeps into Roark's room because the door is unlocked, and she's performing Joan of Arc,
which is a poem that play we did.
Yes,
for this
and
show.
There are various Joan of Arcs out there. Yeah. There's a Schiller Joan of Arc, there's a Shaw Joan of Arc, but I will venture to say that this passage is an Ayn Rand Joan of Arc. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
that,
so she
as
did.
a theater person, is really a lot of fun. I will say though, I love Roark in the novel. Roark in these Vesta Dunning passages is a little colder than we get him more filled out in the novel. I think in these passages, he's a little cold. I don't know how you guys feel about that.
Well, I wanted to read a little bit of this opening of when they meet.
Yeah, that's great.
It's not really a meet cute, but it's a meet violent eruption or something like that. But it just says so much about both of their characters, how they, and how could you not fall in love with Vesta Dunning in this opening scene, especially if you're interested in the type of passionate pursuit of values that she is demonstrating in this opening line. A girl, so it goes, I'm not gonna read the whole passage here, but a girl stood in the middle of the room with her back to him. So he's entering his room. It's his room. This is his room, right? And so a girl is standing in the middle of the room with her back to him. She whirled about when she heard the door knock against the wall. His eyes could not catch the speed of her movement. He had not seen her turn, but there she was suddenly, facing him, as if she had sprung up from the floor and frozen for a second. Her short brown hair stood up wildly with the wind of the motion. Her thin body stood as if it had stopped, twisting and loose. I'll stop there. But then she says, this is her first line, and outside of her reading her quotes of her practicing, she says, and I love this, "What do you want here?" She snapped ferociously. And she's in someone else's room. And that's the first line. She's interrupted in her rehearsal. And she's like, "What do you want here? What are you doing here?" Right. And he's like, "Well," said Roark, "don't you think that I should ask you that?" And, she looked at him at the room. "Oh," she said something, extinguishing itself in her voice, "I suppose it's your room. I'm sorry." And then they have this interesting conversation about what she's performing and what it matters to her.
Notice, so right at the top, we get, actors have a kinesthetic quality, right? A physical quality. And we get that she is always energetic and moving and swirling. And you'll hear more about that later. And sometimes they talk about her as being even awkward in her movements and so on. But that's
like her core characteristic, right? In terms of how she as an artist is, Ayn Rand in the Vesta Dunning passages says she broke all the rules of the screen. And by the way, Anne, you sent right before we recorded today, you sent a screening of Greta Garbo, and then YouTube showed me another clip, which was the next one, which was Orson Welles talking about Greta Garbo and James Cagney. And he said of James Cagney that he broke all the rules, right? That's what he just didn't make sense for the screen, but he made it work, right? So it was just an interesting, I don't know, I'm sure Orson Welles had not read Vesta Dunning. I'm sure that was just his own, but here's a master of the screen talking about that same kind of thing. And Greta Garbo, wasn't she kind of a vision of Ayn Rand for Vesta Dunning? Is that correct?
I don't know about for Vesta Dunning, but Rand definitely admired her. I think Leonard mentions the very first film of Kate Hepburn, the early Katharine Hepburn. I don't remember the title of that movie. Do you, Jeff?
A Bill of Divorcement. I believe.
Bill of divorcement. So I would say go look at that, because it's not the Katharine Hepburn you probably have seen over the decades. It's really a fun, beautiful, young Katharine Hepburn.
Now, I wanted to just mention as an aside that the clip of Garbo, which Anne referred to, is a screen test that was taken at Universal in the late 1940s. And if you want to get, and it's without sound, or MOS, or mit ohne sound, as they corruptedly say on the sets in Hollywood, combining English and German. She is in a silent screen test for a picture she was thinking of doing, but this is at the time that she would have appeared in the Fountainhead had she agreed to do the part. So if you want to look at Garbo at her real peak, on as a visual actress and as a performer, even though this is just an excerpt and a test, your mind really can wander into what it would have been like had she in fact appeared on screen opposite Gary Cooper, and what kind of synergy that performance would have drawn out. You know, in a way, you could think of what would happen had Vesta Dunning appeared with Roark in the Fountainhead in the early part of the novel, where she occupied space, a space, incidentally, after it was cut, that Ayn Rand, and this is something I wanted to mention, Ayn Rand commented to a biographer early on that in an oral history, that there was something about the early part of the novel without her that needed adjustment, and she didn't have time to make that adjustment.
Interesting.
And the Roark Dominique romance would have been, in her view, started earlier had she had a chance to repair the breach and do further work with the novel in its with the in the midst of the cutting. Now, I don't exactly know where that falls, because the manuscript was delivered with Vesta in it, and then there was editing that went on, during the next period of time under Archibald Ogden, the advocate of the Fountainhead, from Bob's Merrill, who accepted the job. So I don't know exactly where it could have been shaped or reshaped, but she did notice that there was a problem.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So I remember reading the novel I must have been 17 or 18 years old, but I don't know if it was in the first reading or in subsequent readings, but I remember thinking, surely this is not the first woman that Roark has been with. And then when the early Ayn Rand came out, it was like, yeah, I knew there was got to be another girl in it. But it's really a terrific passage, and I encourage people. I don't know if it's 40 or 50 pages, and I think, Kirk, you said it kind of functions as a little short story. But today, when I worked on it, I thought, I'd love to stage this. We've had the opportunity to do some stagings at OCON, Objectivist conferences, and what fun this would be to have a young actress and a Roark, because there's a lot of dialogue. Yeah. Even if you had somebody read some of the narration. I don't know if we'll ever do that again, but if we do, I'm interested.
Yeah, and I think so. The story in Early Ayn Rand of Vesta Dunning, it plays out the whole relationship between Roark and Vesta, from this meat volcano this meat eruption rather than meet cute that I just announced. And one of the great things about this condensing of it is, one, I do think you need to have the novel's story in the background to understand the context. So you have to, when they're communicating, it's the way it would have been placed in the novel is it would have gone in the background of several different other events. So for instance, there's an argument that Vesta and Roark have, or it's not so much as an argument, because it's never really an argument with Roark. It's always just one person yelling at him or something, right? And he's always just, okay. But
or no.
Or just saying no or something like that. But it does, he's unperturbable, he's unshakable, right? Is his whole character. and he doesn't think there's anything wrong with what he's doing. But there's a moment when Peter Keating comes to their house with them together, and this is after they've slept together for the first time. It's like right after, I think, and he offers Roark a job. So like this happens in the novel in a different context. We see it here that this is when he offers, and Roark finally accepts it, right? So this is when Roark has left Cameron, he's kind of on his own, and now he's struggling for money, and he's going to be, some kind of low-level engineer is all he wants to be. He won't sell his art to Peter Keating, and he's kind of abrupt to Peter Keating, as he always is. And Vesta yells at him in a sense that she's like, why can't you be human? Why can't you do this? Why can't you be
nice?
Why can't you just be nice? He asked us out for a beer. Right?
All those words that you hear about Ayn Rand, why don't you be nice?
Yeah. And that's one of the things. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things about it's interesting reading this is because there's often criticisms of Roark, like, why doesn't he go get a beer? And some of that's kind of addressed here, right? Because Peter Keating is like, and he's like, well, what am I going to talk to him about? I don't have anything in common with the guy, right? It's not, and he doesn't say it like that. He obviously says it in Randian terms that are much better literary fodder than I'm doing. But he says no, but he does explain in a few words about his, having nothing to talk about with those people. Because there's other contexts, which is like later on, when she'll talk about him at parties that she brings him to, right? Mm-hmm. So she starts introducing him to her friends. And you could imagine how that's like to introduce someone like Roark to all your friends. And they all think he's an insufferable egotist, even though most of them are more successful than he is. Right. So they've achieved something. He's achieved nothing. He's like barely an engineer at this place. He's barely holding on to a job. And, but he's this insufferable egotist. I mean, these are some of the little touches that I think are just so grand about this Vesta Dunning passage. That is very short, easy to read, less than an hour of reading, 30, 40
Well, and if you've never read The Fountainhead, read that first, because that is a wonderful experience. Yeah,
you should shut this off right now and just start reading that. I don't think anybody is listening to this who hasn't read The Fountainhead. If you are, I don't know what's wrong with you. Listen.
That hasn't read Atlas Shrugged. And I was going to say that I mentioned that Vesta and Kay Gonda have an interesting relationship, a kind of generational connection, intergenerational connection. I think the same thing is true of Roark as depicted in this passage of Vesta Dunning, and the character of Hank Rearden as a young man in Atlas. I think there's some interesting similarities in that are just, that there's not a lot about Rearden's background as a young man. There are things that are said about him in the present as a mature person, and then there are references to his behavior in the past. But it's not a sure bet, but there's just this opportunity to line up these characters that were gestating at different times in the big superstructure of her writing career, and you're thinking, wow, this was, these are notes in a character, Roark, in this Vesta Dunning scene that might have been pulled out and recycled and reinterpreted in another literary work. And I found that those kinds of similarities, developments all over the 1930s writing, because there's so much going on. There's so many different, from the late 20s to the late 30s, a 10-year period where there's just an enormous amount of work happening, and lots of characters, and lots of opportunity for a character to develop and present itself in a story, and then get cut and reappear possibly later on. That's another interesting reason to take a look at this cut material.
Well, Dr. Peacock's opening really talks about romantic realism in his introduction. And if you've read Romantic Manifesto, this is a good sort of refresher there. I'm sorry, Kirk, you were going to say something.
No, I was going to read a couple super chats real quick. Just wanted to say thank you to Mary Aline, Jonathan Honig, Jerry Egan. Hello. And Mary Aline said, time with Keating would not be a good use of his time, which I think is a good, very true, a truism.
Well, and it's something we should think of. Sometimes you kind of get dragged out to something, and you think, and I think Roark actually says, I have more fun alone. I enjoy being alone more. So thank you, all our friends on the super chat. Thank you.
Well, there's also an element of there's a dynamic between Roark and Keating that's in the novel that would be possibly interrupted by having Roark and Keating interact with Vesta as a component of that interaction in this phase, because Roark is not 100% antagonistic toward Keating. There is some kind of engagement there that is doesn't bespeak someone who's totally 100% contemptuous of,
especially in the beginning.
Excuse me.
And it
he gives them the benefit of the doubt. Right.
And it has there's a real arc to that relationship in all its different facets, and it's not just one that's imposed upon Roark by the circumstances of the novel and the fact that he has a competitor who's was also a former schoolmate, but there's actually some interaction between the two of them, and there's more texture to that relationship than would otherwise be suggested if you thought of them as complete adversaries. They are in very real ways adversaries, but Roark has more engagement with him than meets the eye.
But I think Roark admires that Keating understands there's something about Roark. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I think it's not that Roark sees Keating blowing him off. Keating's asking him for advice. Now, of course, Roark gives that famous advice, don't ask anybody for advice. But the fact that Keating asks is part of his respect for Roark.
Yeah, so what you see with Vesta Dunning, for instance, is that she is like the first time they have sex, although it's not described, of course, but like the lead up to it in the short story or the Vesta Dunning sequence, she basically says, "I love you." Like there's something about you that I find really special, and essentially it's an ego. It's like a hymn to his greatness, and that, but she's conflicted in a certain way at the same time. And it's when she starts to realize what's great about him. And that's, I think, what makes it so egotistical in an actual definitional sense, is that, he's like, she is reflecting what he admires about himself in herself, in a sense. And she's recognizing that. Now, the issue is that this is where the conflict comes in the arc of the two characters. And what's nice about reading it here, by the way, is that, the novel's long, Fountainhead's long, and sometimes it can be very challenging to keep in mind the arc of all the characters and all that's going on, right? And with Vesta Dunning, you see it all compacted right there, 40 pages. You got the beginning, the meet cutes, you have some of the problems, you have their first love scene, you have, because right at first they don't have sex like right away. She kind of just lingers around and she doesn't know why at first. And then, blah, 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 it goes on and on and on. And then there's some problems. She's not ready to let him go, but she knows there's a moment when she knows she's going to have to let him go. She's not the woman for him. She could tell, and he knows it, but they're still going to kind of enjoy I feel like the
story that I get in Vesta Dunning is her rise to stardom. She's in a show. He sees her in that show. She's fabulous. And then she gets the offer to go to Hollywood. And this is the, sort of cliche that she gives up a theater career to go to Hollywood and her career goes downhill. So it's not just she's a side issue. You get her arc as well. I'm sorry, Kirk, go ahead.
No, that's exactly the point of the arc I was trying to make, is this idea that you see this in compact over time, and she starts to shift. Like at the beginning, she has this dream of playing Jeanne d'Arc in this grand thing of like, showing it her way. just exactly like how Howard Roark wants to draw and to create stuff
Right.
his way. This starts to shift as she starts, and it's not like all at once, it's little touches, right? She starts to care about what reviewers say. And he says this line like, "You're disgusting. Like, why do you care what reviewers say?"
Well, Rand makes
great
a
art.
lovely thing where she keeps rereading the little review that's good, right?
Yeah,
It's not
exactly.
just she reads the review as she likes it. She keeps opening it up and look, and he's like, this, as you say, he says this is disgusting, but because she's fawning over it.
Yeah. And she like folds it up and like, like doesn't bring it back to him, but she keeps it, right? And then that leads to like other roles that are these silly, the girl next door type thing. And and then she gets this screen role that that then just changes everything. So yeah.
That there's a really interesting line I just wanted to read. It's just a sidebar to what you're saying here, but it's about her appearance in that play, and the critical, the narrative critical voice reacting to the impact of that performance. And I guess it's a summary of reviews that were given the day after, or were printed the day after the opening night. And it's, quote, "Her part was described officially as a second feminine lead, but for those who saw the opening performance, there had been no leads and no other actors in the cast, or hardly any play. There had been only a miracle." And I think that's a wonderful line in two respects. One, man, Auschwitz, isn't that why you go to the theater, to experience something like that when it happens? And when it happens, you will remember it for the rest of your life. And two, I'm reminded, I sort of am haunted by the voice of Addison DeWitt in All About Eve. In the hardly any play, meaning the fiery music, as he describes Eve Harrington's performance in All About Eve, just took center stage and overcame everyone. And Vesta Dunning in this respect is a similar kind of fire, which is wonderfully
there
described.
Are so many beautiful lines here in the writing. One of the last lines of the whole thing is a Roark saying, a narrator saying of Roark, afterward he remembered that magnificent performance.
Mm-hmm.
So even though he's let her go and she's done all these silly things in Hollywood and is stuck, but he remembered that magnificent performance. That was important to him.
Yeah, and I think that's why a part of him did love her, and it was one of there was something to love. I mean, it's a very strange, having read Fountainhead several times, and it's been a few years since I've read it again, but it is strange to see him in this kind of relationship, because there always is the question of like, why, right? Like, and I think it's a legitimate question of why. And one of the questions I had for you two is, how would inclusion of this character have changed Roark in our view of him, in the totality of him? Would this have been included? But it was cut for a reason, which we'll talk about. But
I mean, I guess there are two ways of going about that. Either the performance, the script in its current iteration would have been attuned to and modulated to accommodate and grow into the Roark that we know, or it would have been, truly cut. If there was absolutely no choice, no chance for making that revision happen. One other thing I wanted to say, as far as really great writing, I think Ayn Rand's descriptions of nature and human beings in nature and physical movement are some of the most captivating and gripping in all of the world literature that I know. And I think the first two paragraphs on page 386 of the Early Ayn Rand, the paperback version, the opening sequence where Roark is coming home in a snowstorm, has really some of the most beautiful writing that I have ever read from Ayn Rand, and I'm glad to be able to visit that writing here, even if it's forever separate from the novel.
Yeah, I mean the descriptions of Vesta in here are fantastic. The questioning of her beauty, is she really attractive? And there's, you know, this is all done in a very Randian sense of the relationship between concretes and abstractions. And Peikoff talks about this, her Aristotelian philosophy coming through in her literature, that the specific concretes that she uses make it very clear what kind of person Vesta is if you're paying attention, and it's unmistakable in a sense. And I think that's why you might come up with the screen test by Greta Garbo or something, where her hair is all kind of fluffed, you know, not perfect, and it's a little wilder, right? Like there's a kind of, and then there is in that screen test you showed. We'll try to put it in the show notes so people could see that. You don't have to watch the whole thing, just kind of scrub through, and you could see also the kind of like, which is described in Vesta, the jerkiness of one movement of emotion to the next, right? And just like she moves and it's like this thing happens and it's like, holy crap, right? It's like, and it's all over the place in a sense, and it's kind of wild. And that's how, and Ayn Rand is describing that what you're seeing in that screen test. I think she's describing it well in words.
Well,
Okay,
I think
so
also if you look at those early Katharine Hepburn, you'll get the whole body where the legs are
Yeah.
akimbo and they're not, you know, especially
It's all
when
over
you're
the
talking about
place.
the 40s.
yeah,
It's not so perfectly ladylike. I do want to answer your question though about how would this have
thank you.
changed the novel. I think when I spoke to Jerry Egan about this a couple of times, she talked about Roark being rather cold in this section. And I think when you look at this section versus the novel, you actually see how warm Roark is in the novel. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, I mean, he seems a little bit more harsh here in certain cases. Like there's a time, for instance, when he says, Vesta, I'm paraphrasing, Vesta, get out of here. I don't want to see you for a couple of weeks. Right. And he's just like, get out of here. Right. And she's like, but what about New Year's Eve? Because they had made, and he's like, yeah, that'll be fine. Come back on New Year's Eve. And he's like, just leave for 10 days. I don't want to see it. And that is a little harsh, right? Like they're supposed to be dating. They've like, why was that happen? Now, again, we have to remember always that Ayn Rand would have changed a lot had this made it into the next phase of the novel, but
you may have seen him working in between and so on.
Yeah, there may have been something else. And again, it would have all been smoothed into the whole story. That's what Jeff was saying. And we have to recall that none of this has taken Ayn Rand's big edits and how it would have been put into it, nor her fine-tuned edits.
Right.
It made it. There's none of
us after her death looking at material that she left that was not published. So this was unpublished. I do want to say what we're talking about next Tuesday, Red Pawn, is actually a treatment, a screenplay treatment for a film. And the pawn actually is like a chess piece pawn. And the red is referring to sort of the Russia aspect of her world. But it's fabulous. And it is a whole of itself because it's a treatment. So it's not bits and pieces. It's one whole sort of look at what a movie might be like.
Now, it's like the first thing she sold, right? Wasn't it the first thing she sold?
I don't know. You said that earlier, but I don't know.
I thought it was. Maybe I'm wrong. So don't quote me on that.
No, we'll check on it.
We'll check and we'll confirm for next week. But I thought it was the first thing. But I hope you guys will all read Red Pawn, so you know that are listening now, so you can kind of follow along with our discussion of it. And now, before we leave Vesta Dunning, I just want to make sure you guys if you had anything you wanted to add about Vesta Dunning, who she was, and maybe like we could end on why she was cut in the end? Like, why? What was Ayn Rand's?
I just want to read the
reason?
paragraph that Dr. Peikoff quotes.
Please, yeah.
Then I'll leave the end to Jeff. She had not learned the proper camera angles. She had not learned the correct screen makeup. Her mouth was too large, her cheeks too gaunt, her hair uncombed, her movements too jerky and angular. She was like nothing ever seen on film before. She was a contradiction to all standards. She was awkward, crude, shocking. She was like a breath of fresh air. The studio had expected her to be hated. She was suddenly worshipped by the public. She was not pretty, not gracious, not gentle, not sweet. She played the part of a young girl, not as a tubular flower, but as a steel knife. Our reviewer said she was a cross between a medieval page boy and a gun moll. She achieved the incredible. She was the first woman to have ever allowed herself to make strength attractive on the screen.
Well, I'll just add that that's a right out of, or a variation on a theme presented by Mick Watts in Ideal, who's Kay Gonda's publicist. And he says, in a moment of drunken despair, essentially the same thing. She's original. She's unlike anything you've ever heard or deserved to experience. He has an element of bitterness in his delivery of that. Last thing I wanted to say about this, as a, it's Vesta, but it's also Roark, and Roark is a character in his mode here is a different Roark than we would have experienced, than we do experience in the Fountainhead. And I'm thinking that there's a line here, and it comes at the end of that brilliant 2 paragraphs describing his move from the streets of New York into the lobby of his building and his movement upstairs. But this is a note which something that redounds for me throughout the whole Vesta Dunning thing, which is atypical of Roark, and it's Roark pushed slightly over the edge, because as Ayn Rand writes, Roark had closed his eyes after coming in and shaking the snow off, but he, quote, he went up swiftly up the stairs, his body alive in a bright, exhilarating exhaustion, a weariness demanding action, not rest to relieve it. And that's a line that I don't think Roark crosses, because that's a line, this particular state of being is like a beat over the edge of I don't want to say sanity, but it's on in this moving into a spectrum of real tension that redounds into action, that puts a crimp on yourself. So his whole demeanor toward her, his coolness, his indifference, his aggravated indifference, I think is more of a sign of his own problems that he's experiencing at this time, and problems in a way that wouldn't have manifested themselves exactly in the same way in the Fountainhead, because he never gets. This is that line that I just read seems to be suggesting that he is, going over the edge into a point of frenzy, as opposed to over being pushed to the edge, but still centered and serene inside, as he's described in the novel. And that's a big difference.
Well, there's this thing about him that I think is interesting, is there never seems to be a moment of uncertainty in the actual novel, in my regard. Like, there's this idea of him trying to understand the problem of the dean. And that's like, so there's something he doesn't know that he's trying to know. And there is a sense of his growth. There's a few instances where he makes mistakes as an architect and he rectifies it with his own money, for instance. But for me, I always thought there was this feeling of him as a character, as this untouchable, or this perfection of the ideal man in all his form. The Vesta Dunning to me really showed, and I understand why Ayn Rand cut it, and but it did show to me about his character a little side of him really being like trying to, like, he is a person trying to figure things out, right? And he doesn't have everything figured out at 16, right?
Well, he's not as heroic.
Yeah. So, and I think that's one of the reasons she may have cut it is, I think now, again, she might have smoothed it out as she, put it, if she did put it into the book in the end, but she didn't. But that was one thing I just found interesting reading this, is that he didn't 100% know himself why he was staying with her. And he even kind of comments on, he's not certain, he doesn't think it'll last anyway, and has in his own Roarkian fashion. I just wanted to end by saying the reason Ayn Rand cut this, and it's worthy of contemplation of the novel, I think, if you have read and studied The Fountainhead, of understanding art and her projection here. She said on multiple occasions that she cut it mostly because Vesta Dunning was superfluous to the plot and characterization, because she represents essentially the same problem that Gail Winan represents, which is essentially the achievement, the thought that in a secondhand way, you can achieve a noble end by ignoble means, right? You could be a secondhander in the means to get to some noble end. And that's her view of, I want to do Joan d'Arc, and I'll do all the stupid things they want me to do if it allows me to get there. But the problem, of course, and you see this more clearly, or very clearly in these 30, 40 pages of Vesta Dunning, is that it leads to the destruction of your soul. It has to. And it's very logical.
The Gail Winan picture is so much bigger.
And it's more integrated into the plot, and But I think she just thought, like Ayn Rand said, it was superfluous. Like, I don't need two of these characters. And it doesn't serve any end.
Well,
and so
I think she has some things like, with Keating, but I know that we're going to go a little bit on Clubhouse. I don't know.
I just want to say one thing about that superfluous. I just want to put a sidebar to that. This is superfluousness on the order of your darling, your character. You're escorting her sobbing to the executioner's chamber all the way. This is not a light cut and it's great. This is bloody cutting, because those were heartfelt, mind-felt characters and artistic brushstrokes that had to be.
She thought it was some of the best of her writing. In this section, so that's great to read what Ayn Rand thought was some of the best of her writing.
And I just want to make one plug. We're not going to talk too much about this because we're going to go on to Clubhouse now. But I just want to make a plug to everybody of the archives, because, and I'll tell Daniel to put this in the show notes if he doesn't mind. There's a great letter that very few times you could see Ayn Rand talking about this, besides the journals of Ayn Rand about Vesta Dunning and then the early Ayn Rand, where Ayn Rand is talking to Archibald Ogden for the 25th anniversary of the Fountainhead introduction. He was going to write that. Of course, if you know the Fountainhead 25th anniversary introduction, it's a very well-written one by Ayn Rand. Anyway, there's a very interesting sequence where they argue, or where she's arguing with him about why she cut Vesta Dunning. And it's an interesting discussion of her thought process as an artist, how she takes feedback, when she likes it, when she doesn't. And it's also, to me, a great example of integrity. She has, in the kind of artistic integrity she maintains it her whole life. She never would. But so I really recommend reading that. And I just wanted to plug the archives, because I think, I work at the Ayn Rand Institute, for full disclosure, I'm in fundraising for it. But if you're not supporting the archives, it's just such an important, tool. There's so many good things. Like, this is great letter that you really get to see Ayn Rand thought process in just a couple quick pages. We'll put it in the show notes, and you can learn a lot about how to be a good person and live she's pretty staunch in this letter. She does not hold back. And you could see that, her passion, her thoughtfulness, and some of her fire, which I think is right in this sense. So please join us at Clubhouse next. Jeff and Anne, thank you so much.
Can you tell us the name of our Clubhouse house?
Oh, I don't know. Daniel, what's the name of the Clubhouse?
It's got a long name, I feel like.
Link is in the chat.
The link is in the chat. Yeah. Okay. So the link is in the chat.
And it's on our Clubhouse Radio Ragnar. So
Radio Ragnar. Okay, so go to Radio Ragnar. I'll have to figure it out because I don't use Clubhouse. But bye, everybody. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank
Jeff,
you.
Thanks for having us, and thanks for
For
talking
having
about
me.
Vesta
Yeah,
Dunning.
Definitely.
hopefully you both can join for Clubhouse because it scares
I'm a big
me.
fan of. She's scared of Clubhouse, but I'm a big fan of Jeff. You know, he's been my playwright. He's been my composer. So it's